map is red.
The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease. That our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Good morning. It's good to see all of you and to have you as part of the forum today. Our presenter does not need much, if any, introduction. Dr. Isaac Arten is our Theologian-in-Residence. He is a theologian who teaches at SLU and is also a very talented woodworker. And so if you are ever in need of anything, I strongly suggest from experience that you talk to Dr. Arten. But anyway, I was talking with Isaac recently, or a little while ago, and I don't know whether he was working on it or he had something that he was working on at the time. We talked about this subject, which is a class that he was teaching, I believe he just taught this semester, right? On the common good. And it just kind of caught my attention, and I said, hey, I think that would be a wonderful thing to talk about at church, as we're all dealing with how it is that we relate to each other, work together, dispel some of the distrust that exists in our common life. So he has put together this presentation on the Christian life and the common good. Isaac, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. Good morning, all. It's good to be here. Good to see you. Always glad to have the chance to talk a bit about some of the work that I do at SLU and as a theologian. I'm going to adjust my Borg implants here. There we are. Glad to be here this morning. Glad to have a chance to talk with you about this class that I've been teaching for the last several years through the honors program at SLU. The course is titled Our Common Home, and it takes its focus as the concept of the common good. This is a sophomore seminar that's required of every honors student. So the students in the honors program tend to join that program in the beginning of their second year, and this is typically one of the first courses that they take. And it's themed around the common good with shared syllabus for the first half of the semester, and then the instructor's own interests in the second half of the semester. So it's been an interesting one to design and teach. And what I'd like to do today is to walk you through some of what I teach there, and to give you some of the language and concepts that I work with when I am teaching this class for these students. So let me begin right away by saying out loud that humans are basically social creatures. And it's amazing how many different fields say so. Depending on what you study, you might be studying philosophy, biology, sociology, psychology, anthropology, political science, and even theology. And you'll encounter some version of that basic statement. Humans, by nature, are social creatures. And what we mean by that is that it's our relationships that define, that nurture, that protect us, that hold us accountable for good goals or for bad behavior. And it's our relationships that make it possible for us to thrive. We need each other. Now, it's not only the relationships that we have or that we recognize as those closest to us. It's not our immediate families and our best friends that define the limit of these relationships that shape and form us. But it's also the ways that we relate to our neighbors, to strangers, to institutions, and to many others. And the quote here is, whose lives are closely linked with ours in some way. Now, I call that out as a phrase because it's one of the phrases from one of the forms of the prayers of the people in the Book of Common Prayer. As we pray for the world and for the various peoples in it, one of the options that we have in the prayer book includes this line that we pray for those whose lives are closely linked with ours. And it teaches us to see not only the people in the pew with us, but also the people that we depend on, known and unknown, in various parts of the world and in various settings. So that was always my favorite form of the prayers. When I was in seminary and had an internship for a church in Chapel Hill, when I was given the opportunity to choose the prayers, it was likely to be that one. Can I? Okay, that should do the thing.
Pointed at that.
Okay, there we are. You'll probably recognize this material here on the screen here. In the Episcopal Church, in our catechism, in the back of the Book of Common Prayer, we recognize a couple of ways of thinking about what it means to be human. And all of the pieces that are named here in the question and answer of what it means to be human, these are all social things. These are things that we don't do in a vacuum or purely as individuals. So when, as Episcopalians, we ask, what does it mean to be human? And this is a question that you should ask with some regularity and rigor, by the way. We hear back the answer that first, we are part of God's creation made in the image of God. And the Catechism immediately recognizes that your follow-up question is going to be, well, what does any of that mean? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And the Catechism will tell us that what it means to be in the image of God as humans, a phrase that we draw from the first chapter of Genesis, means that we are free to make choices, to love, to create, to reason, and to live in harmony with creation and with God. Right away, our relationship to God, the analogy, the way we say that humans are like God in some way, lies in the ways that we relate to the world that we live in, to other creatures, and to God's own being. So we begin with an acknowledgement of our relationships. You can't love by yourself, after all. You reason in dialogue with others. You create in awareness of your needs and the needs of someone else. Others in different fields take other ways of explaining this. So from Aristotle in ancient Greece, we have the idea of humans as political animals. What am I pointing at? Okay. And in political science, we have what is my sort of favorite colloquial example when I'm teaching the class with students, is this book, the cover of which, the 1958 edition, is on the right-hand side of the screen here. In 1936, the American political scientist Harold Lasswell published this book, Politics: Who Gets What, When, How. The book itself is in the public domain at this point, and you can easily find PDF copies of this, and I'll warn you that it's a dense, dense read. But the main effect that it seems to have had on political science is the title itself, which gives us a sort of thumbnail definition of politics and what politics does. Throughout the book, Lasswell argues for the idea that politics is this argument that people have that's structured by rules, it's a formal argument, and extended over time about how we distribute goods, both tangible and intangible, in society. In Lasswell's understanding, we're talking here about basic human needs, the sort of material things that we need to get by, to stay alive, and to live a dignified human existence, but also the intangibles, the things that we depend on to structure and order our relationships, even when we can't sense them directly. Things like justice, leisure, representation. All things that we recognize as being good for us as humans and necessary for our social existence, but not things that we can build out of raw matter, things that require a different way of thinking. For many of these goods, we are involved in gathering them for ourselves, but we can't secure everything we need purely by our own effort. We depend on each other. I'm always fond of pointing out to my students that bananas don't grow at commercial scale in Missouri, and neither do coffee beans. And so if you depend on coffee, or if you like to have a banana with your cereal or on your toast, you are going to depend on people in other parts of the world. Their lives will be closely linked with yours, in other words. And so, in order to achieve something like the good life for yourself, you depend, to a great degree, on cooperation with others. Now, that very practical example is one level of talking about how we distribute goods in society and the principles we use for doing that. But on the level of something like justice, there's a whole other level of things involved here. It might be possible for me to enforce my own internal rules or code of honor on others as a person directly, but that's not justice, that's vigilantism. For justice, I depend on a social system, an agreed upon set of norms and rules that I can refer to and that others agree to be bound by. So the common good is a way of talking about the set of goods that humans need that we cannot achieve for ourselves individually and that go beyond any one person's sense of the good and extend into the good of the social order as well, the good of society. Now, I like to point out several things when I talk about the common good. I like to give the definition. Let's see if I can make this work. Oh, there we are. Okay. My basic definition, and the definition here that I've drawn from philosophers back to Plato and Aristotle, through the line at SLU, because we're a Jesuit institution, through Catholic social teaching, and through many Catholic thinkers, and into the present day, that my thumbnail definition for the common good is the situation that exists when we seek to achieve the good for each and the good for all. And right away, I want to contrast that with some things that the common good is not. The common good here is not the greater good. People sometimes use these phrases as if they are interchangeable, and they are very much not. The greater good is calculable. It's a sort of good of the majority. It's a way of saying that if there is 50% plus one good, that's good enough. But the common good is something different. How many of you are familiar with the Ursula K. Le Guin short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas? I have a couple of nods. Okay, generationally very different nods. Okay, all right, cool. For the rest of you, the story was published in the 70s, and so I'm going to spoil it, and that's on you. I'm going to give you the walkthrough of what we're doing here. Ursula K. Le Guin is an American science fiction author. You may know her other work, The Left Hand of Darkness. But the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, tends to show up in situations like Ethics 101 and Intros to Philosophy and things like that. It's very short, 3 or 4 pages. And it consists of a kind of thought experiment describing a utopian society and telling you all of the things that the people in the society have and the things that make them happy. If the point of human society, says Aristotle, is to seek the good life, then Omelas begins with a description of a group of people who have achieved it. They have the things that they need. They have things that keep them supplied. They have things that make them happy. And they have made, says Le Guin, a correct distinction between things that are necessary, between things that are neither necessary nor harmful, and things that are harmful. And as the story goes on, Le Guin takes you beneath the city to a storage closet in a basement where there exists a single, entirely immiserated and abandoned child. And Le Guin asks you as the audience and the characters in the story to think, if you could imagine all the misery in the world concentrated into just one person, and all of the good that is possible in the world thus distributed to everyone else, would you take that calculation? Would you participate in that society? Would you consider it a good life? The title of the story suggests that there are some people who do not. She focuses in the last couple of paragraphs on people who come to learn about the situation that guarantees their happiness, decide that they are unhappy with it, unwilling to accept it, and simply leave. And as I always ask my students, who are the good guys here? Are the protagonists, is the good character in the story the one who simply walks away? Le Guin's short story shows the difference between calculating the good, as in the greater good, and something like the common good, which is, the definition I'm arguing for, the good for each and the good for all. Le Guin's story exists as a kind of critique of utilitarianism, the school of philosophy attributed to J.S. Mill, and others that's associated with, though not limited to, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. The idea that if you can maximize the good in society and minimize the bad, the pain, if you can do that to a level people accept, that's probably as good as it's going to be. Le Guin and the philosophers that I work with in my class reject that notion as they define the common good as something that necessarily includes every member of a society. A good life, if it is not accessible to even one, has not been achieved by all. So the common good is not the greater good, because the common good requires full participation, and the greater good involves some kind of calculation and trade-off. The common good is also not just the simple sum of each person's individual good. We wouldn't describe the common good as being achieved even if, by our own definition, every one of us said, I have a good life. The common good asks that we think not only about individual goods, our good. Sorry, I do that in class all the time and I'm not wired up like this. But ways that we also think about the good of society, the good beyond ourselves. Because we recognize that that's the thing that's going to persist. If we want society to continue providing a good life, or people to have a good life in society, one of the things we assure is not just the good for each person, but that the goods of society continue after any one of our lifespan. So the common good is not just, again, a simple calculation. It's the sum of everyone's good. It's a kind of reciprocal flow of contribution and benefit. I work for the good that I recognize for myself. I work for the good that I want to see for others. I work for the good that I want to see in the social order that I think is best. And others and society at large also work, because that's the way we set them up, to assure my good as well. From a Christian perspective, the common good doesn't reduce any individual to the whole. It wouldn't be enough to say that if society is good, it doesn't matter if any one person thinks life is good. And it also doesn't reduce the significance of the whole in the face of the individual's experience of the good. There's a lot going on here to try to balance these two things. For my class, this all sort of preamble to how we organize these topics in my class. There we are. My class approaches the common good in four ways. And then my interests come at the end of this set. This is the shared bit of our course. The first thing that we do is we try to define what the common good is. That's what we've just been doing in our presence today. How do we define the common good? How do we recognize it? We draw here on classical sources. We draw on Catholic sources. SLU's a Jesuit school, so I'm given a lot of Jesuit and Catholic sources to work with. And given also stories from the contemporary news, I'm forever looking at ways, especially that politicians and public figures name something like the common good, and then how they define what they mean by that. So I always have lots of material to work with in terms of current events and people writing about this. Second, we look at the question of who we include. So if we talk about the common good, and if the common good is the good for all and the good for each, one of the arguments that we have, going all the way back to Aristotle, is an argument about who counts, who we recognize as members of the society that is seeking the common good. For my class, we take this general question from a couple of political philosophers, Kwame Appiah being the one that I particularly like. And then we use the lenses of race, gender, and class as examples of the way that we define belonging or membership and include or exclude people on these bases. Third, we talk about where we see this happening. Where is the common good enacted? And what's the role of the built environment? The spaces and the settings where we live, where we interact with each other, where we transact business, and where we do the sort of political stuff of human life, those places matter. And the way that they are organized tells us something about what we think the good life is and how we teach people to practice the good life. The example that I'm forever using about this is the example of accessibility features in public buildings. So I'm always asking my students, do you know where the accessible entrance is to our classroom building? Could you, if someone needed it, direct them to the ramp, to the elevator, to other features of a building that make it possible for people with various physical limitations, whether that's a broken leg, something that many of us will or have had, or a more permanent condition requiring some kind of mobility aid. Can you direct someone to the accessible parts of a building? And how those figure into the buildings that we work in and the public spaces that we occupy tell us something about how easy we think it can be or should be for people to engage in the purposes of those public places. So where does this happen? Well, it happens in places where we gather. The condition of the places where we gather tell us something about who we think should be or may be involved in that process. So that's our where question. Finally, my class asks questions about why. What motivates people to care about the common good in the first place, and why should they, as future doctors and lawyers and engineers and chemists, why should they care about something called the common good? And here I'm usually focusing on vocation. I'm looking at ways that if much of your life is spent at work, and if your work is the place where you have the largest platform for speaking to others and advocating for a vision of the common good, how will you do that? What will be expected of you in terms of your profession? So my final assignment asks them to imagine themselves in a future professional setting and look for a way that they, as a future professional, might seek the common good. How do you do this as an engineer, as a doctor? How do you do this in law? How do you do this in economics or business? What sort of work will you pursue, and under what conditions will that work allow you to advocate for the good of all and the good for each? Within that, one of the examples that I'm forever using is a software engineer who writes about the ethics of software development. Man's name is Mike Montero. He has a thing called the Developer's Code of Ethics. And one of the early pieces that I started using right when I started teaching theology was a piece that included the quote, "You can't buy ethics offsets in your spare time for the terrible things you do at work." Montero's point was to say that he wants people to develop a sort of integrated ethical personhood, a way of saying that the things that they value, the ethics that they promote, apply to their personal life and to their professional life, to their lives in public, as well as to their sense of their own development and personhood. And Montero, in giving that argument, and then further on giving the sort of code of ethics about design, pointed out that the ways that we design, especially software products, involve processes that will be invisible to most people, but that will have profound effects on your lives. Whether we're talking about how Automated systems direct you to customer service. That's sort of the key the example you are probably most familiar with. Or whether we're thinking about how legal codes and law systems, something like sort of predictive models used in law enforcement and other settings like that affect the people who they are programmed to recognize. So the why question is sort of my vocation question. Why should you care about this? Well, you care about this because you're going to have work to do. You're going to want that work to be meaningful. If you've been paying attention in my class up until this point, you'll recognize that the work that you do will be an expression to some degree of your own values and the things you care about. Okay. Two things I think there's sort of two halves to what I think seeking the common good requires. The first thing it requires is that a habit of moral imagination, or a certain formation of the way that you see the world. One of the reasons that I love including fiction in my class, my students read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, we look at fictional depictions of things any chance I get in a class, is because I recognize that your imagination is formed not only by multiple choice tests, but also by the stories that you encounter. Stories teach us something about the kinds of characters that we encounter in life. They teach us something about the process of character formation. They teach us what is in character and out of character. And so recognizing the importance of fiction for training your imagination and then applying that imagination to the real world that you live in has been a key feature of what I look at. And the term moral imagination is one that I draw from the philosopher Paul Waddell, who talks about this idea as how we become human. Well, we become human in part by learning to see in certain ways, by learning to speak in certain ways, by learning to inhabit stories about ourselves and stories about the world. The second half then is practices of inclusion. If we're talking about the common good, if we are going to say that what we are practicing is the good for each and the good for all, then one of the tasks that we have in front of us as people engaged in public life, as Christians engaged in congregational life, as persons engaged in our own personal lives, is to get the people in the room who can tell us what the good life is and what obstacles they face to experiencing it. One of the things that I'll point out to students all the time is if you're not present, either physically or by means of your voice represented by someone else in a space where decisions are being made, it's possible that the things that you need in that decision will be neglected. Our future is shaped, after all, it's been a sort of political axiom for many years, by those who show up. So one thing that my students pay attention to, one of the things that I teach my students to pay attention to, is there is simply a kind of basis. If we talk about who we include, if we talk about the common good needing to include all of us, then the first thing we look at is how we get more people in the room to talk about what the good life is and what barriers people face to experiencing it. We might consider this a simple form of neighborliness. Here's the Christian term for this is the way that we love our neighbors and who we consider neighbors in the first place. If we're properly considering who our neighbors are, we recognize we have a wider circle beyond our own doors and fences to ask about the state of the neighborhood. And when we think beyond just our house and our street into broader senses of who our neighbors are in bigger settings, we continue to ask those same questions. How can I be a neighbor, even if we don't live right next to each other? How can I take this attitude of neighborliness? The practices that I talk with my students about also include specific kinds of decision making. The teaching drawn from Catholic social thought is the idea of subsidiarity, which has to do with the decisions that affect you should be made as close to you as possible. So if we're going to make a decision and it's going to affect the people in this room, Ideally, to the degree that it's possible, we make the decision for ourselves. The flip side of this is that a decision has to be made at the highest level, or the sort of highest level necessary to effectively solve the problem that we're trying to solve. So there are things to think about. If we're imagining something related to the physical plant, the church building here at St. Peter's, we probably don't need to go beyond the congregation, potentially the diocese, to get decisions made that improve the lives of the people here or solve problems on our building. If we notice that Warson Road has developed a series of very serious potholes, we may be affected by that decision, but by ourselves, we can't solve it. Except in the middle of the night with several bags of cold patch asphalt and balaclavas. But that's not the usual way of doing this. So we recognize we're affected by the decision. We want something done. We can't do it for ourselves, so we have to bump that up a level above us. But that's the sort of basic principle. The people who experience the problem should be among the people who make the decisions. We also recognize, the one other thing here is recognizing the ways that social life makes people vulnerable in particular ways. When I talk about, with my students, I mentioned that when we talk about it, who's included in our vision of the common good, one of the lenses we use to talk about membership and belonging is the lens of class and the problem of poverty. And I talk to my students about my basic definition of poverty being anything that you lack that leaves you vulnerable to neglect or exploitation. So we can think about ways that people who lack material support for their lives are vulnerable to a great many things. You might imagine that a lack of, say, nutritious food might leave you vulnerable to disease. That's a way that a material lack leaves you vulnerable to a problem that someone not in your situation might not experience in the same way. But we can also recognize that if people lack time, they lack the ability to participate in social forms of decision making. If you are at work all the time and don't have the chance to go to the school board meeting or to the city council, neither the school board nor the city council will know what it is you need, and you may be negatively affected by their decisions. You may simply be neglected because nobody knows what you need. You may also find yourself exploited because people who know what you need but prefer that their needs be met instead make the habit of going to those meetings. Now, what I've been trying to do, you can tell me if I've been successful at this or not in a moment, is sort of weave together the political side and the cultural side and the Christian side all together. But I want to land Nope, you. There we go. But I want to land on something distinctly biblical here. In the book of Jeremiah, in the 29th chapter of Jeremiah, the prophet is given the command from God and the thing to tell to the people of Jerusalem: seek the good of the city while you sojourn there. Jeremiah is looking at the Babylonian captivity and the exile. The thing that he's been predicting all along is happening all around him. His people are being taken from their homes and scattered into the empire. And the message that God has for those people who are being sent into exile is: seek the good of the places where you land. Seek the good of the city while you sojourn there. Seek the good of the place where you are in exile. Because even in that position, the desire of God is for the good of all people. The desire of God is for the blessed life. So for Christians, to talk about the common good means to center our social action on this kind of principle. We don't see ourselves as entirely separated from the world around us. Christians often have this way of speaking that we are in the world but not of the world. Largely what that means is that the things that we focus on might be the sense of spiritual good or the sense of morality, the desire to contemplate God, but we all still have to go to the grocery store. We still recognize the needs of the physical life. We recognize that the spiritual life and our focus on the contemplation of God does not excuse us from our own direct needs or from attending to the needs of others. So we center our social action, we center our politics in many ways on this kind of idea, that we seek the good of the places where we live and the people who are our neighbors. We look to make them our friends. For my class, I'll say just a little bit about the way that I bring my own interests to this. For the last several years, as I've been teaching this class on the common good, my section of the class has focused on the idea of the cosmic common good. I found a book by this title as I was doing a literature search for interesting readings, because what I wanted to study, what I wanted my students to study, was the relationship between humans and the non-human world, about the environment around us, about other creatures, about the good of the land and the waters and things like that. And so the last part of our course always focuses on this, with a way of trying to ask an expansive question. If we think of the good of each and the good for all as our goal, is there a way we can push the boundaries of that beyond just humans and into other things? What would it look like, for example, for non-human creatures? What would it look like for animals? What would it look like for waterways? To think of you as a friend, as a neighbor. What would it look like for you to act toward those creatures as a friend and as a neighbor? There's an element of self-interest in this. After all, we as humans need clean air and clean water. We can't go long without drinking. And so we have to find ways to keep waterways healthy and clean, for example. But there's also a sense built into our doctrine of creation and our sense of ourselves as humans in relation to God and in harmony with everything else, that we seek the good of the non-human for its own sake. We seek the good of the world around us for the sake of its flourishing. We seek the good of the world around us for the sake of the flowers, for the sake of the wild rabbits, for the sake of the birds we wake up to every morning. And we seek those because in many ways we join the praise of God that the world around us offers. So, questions about the common good can be extraordinarily practical. Very sort of problem-focused, very how do we make sure everyone has the basics that they need. They can also be deeply philosophical and highly spiritual. Ways of trying to say, can we show the relationship between humans and God by the way that we undertake to structure and to order our relationships to everyone and everything else. So, that's a brief overview of about a semester's worth of work here. And at this point, if you have questions for me or other things that I haven't considered, let's bring those onto the table.
Questions? Comments?
Thanks very, very much. Elizabeth and I have been talking about this and wondering how you were going to hammer us. And you did it very gently, but we got hammered anyway. So, by way of confession, this is my, I go through a moral dilemma every summer because there's this one kind of summer shirt I like. It is, where's Jimmy? He had, the sort of shirt that Jimmy had on, it's short sleeve, it's knit, you can throw it in the washer, you put it in the dryer and shake it out, except Elizabeth gives it a whack on the iron, even though I don't need it and don't want it. This is an ongoing discussion. It has 3 buttons, one at the throat and 2 below. And it's got to be 100% cotton. Where does that cotton come from? Mm-hmm. So I can't tell if it's Egyptian cotton, and I used to have an Egyptian cotton shirt that was very expensive. And it was so expensive and so nice that I didn't wear it very often, and then it just disappeared. So, but I can look at a shirt and tell this kind of knit summer shirt, worn with the shirt tail out, I can tell across the room whether it's really cotton or if it's got some messed up stuff into it that makes it sticky in the summer and you can't perspire through it and it won't dry right. I'm a little crazy, or a lot crazy about this thing. So, where is the cotton? Is it grown in South Texas? Is it grown in Alabama? Or is it grown in Egypt? Not the snooty kind of cotton, or someplace else? And then what is my responsibility to the people? And I know the answer to this, and I haven't really figured out a solution. People who work in the fields in this country or anyplace else. It's labor intensive, it's hard on the soil. Cotton is a real killer to the mineral life of ongoing soil health. So I'll just throw that back at you.
Of course. So this is a terrific example of the way that this question is really complicated, because there are a couple of things that humans can't avoid. In many ways, we cannot avoid, there's a theologian who calls it friction with other things. We bump into other creatures, other humans, absolutely all the time, simply because we depend on each other to keep us alive and thriving. There is not a way for us to go through life having no impact on the world around us. It just doesn't happen. The moral side of this is to ask exactly the kinds of questions that you're asking. What responsibilities do I have for the health of the earth that I depend on for growing things, the health of the people who do the work that I don't or can't do to provide those things for myself? A lot of it has to do with considering very carefully the places we buy from, and beginning to ask questions about why we can't see, why we don't have the information that you're asking. That's a way of saying what we want is the systems that we rely on to be more transparent and to have the ability to hold accountable the systems that provide for us in terms of sort of industrial systems and production and supply chain. Thank you. That's the word that I was stuck on there for a second. All of those systems, many of them are opaque to us. Many of them are opaque to us for a reason. The moral question then has to be, how do we sort of get beyond that opaqueness? How do we, because industrial systems don't occur in nature. They are human constructs. They are political constructs. When we start to recognize, I want to have as little negative impact on other people and on the waterways and on the land and things that I can, then we get to start asking questions about how we try to reorganize and reorder systems to allow us to have the information to make those decisions. And in the meantime, we, by our practices, make as little negative impact as we can.
How much is that going to cost me?
So a few years ago, there was a really interesting article that came out about somebody setting a minimum, rather than trying to say, there's a sort of maximum I will spend for some basic object. A person wrote an article about an experiment setting a minimum price. I will not spend less than. And because this was a thought experiment that ran in a major publication, it was absurdly high. It was something like $150 for, was it a t-shirt? Was it a polo shirt? It was some kind of basic garment item like that. It's an important question because at the moment, the way that we've built the systems that give us our food and clothing, for example, making that kind of commitment will absolutely be more expensive. And that's difficult because I've just been talking about poverty, right? I've just been talking about people who are not in the position to say, I will never pay less than X for this object that I need. So I'm not able to give you a single answer to that question. I'm simply able to affirm the question at the moment. My job as a theologian is to be sure that you know enough of the questions that you can be asking them. And when you start to run into places where you can't get the answers, you know to ask why. That's a big part of my role, is to say, in many cases, our conscience tells us to make the best choice we can. and to ask further questions about why my options are what they are.
I'm going to follow up on what you just opened up, which is the whole questioning in my own mind about, how does this impact me? What are my options? What are my responsibilities? And fortunately, I'm sitting here at St. Peter's because I realize that our church offers incredible support in answering, for me, that question. Where are the opportunities out here? I just actually opened up my bulletin, our program this morning, and all the way through it are ways that there are opportunities and ways it seems to me that we are seeking the good or looking at the question of whether this is where we want to go. And we have 3 commissions right now. We've got our community outreach, our worship, and I forgot the name of the third one. They're all trying to define where the opportunities are for our members and for our whole community. And I think our church is unique and wonderful in that way. And I just really appreciate you did make me think a lot, though. Every time you said something where am I on track? Have I gotten, is there a new venue or a new path I could take? And I just thank St. Peter's for giving us thoughtfulness and questioning, and then some ideas of how to support ourselves to do some things, or think some things.
Excellent, thank you.
So I'm one of the people who are really highly suspicious whenever I hear the word common good, because historically, for the past couple of generations, that was hijacked by communism and totalitarian regimes who always argued, hey, for the common good, you just need to do what we tell you to do. And that resulted in 175 million people dying in the last century. So I commend you for your bravery for taking on this subject. But I'm just voicing out that's where this context is coming from. The past century was horrible because of the common good being used and weaponized against people by those governments. So
one of the things, and thank you for bringing that up. One of the things that struck me as I've done the research for this class and I've been teaching this class is the importance of recognizing that the Christian perspective on the common good requires that we fully acknowledge the distinct personhood of every person who we consider a member of society and our neighbor, and the good of society as a whole, which is one of the ways that we ensure the practice of the good for each person. So that's the setting where each of us have our live and move and have our being. In the late 1980s, John Paul II wrote about this exact problem. And one of the things that he gives us is a way of saying Christian political theology stands in contrast to every political system in some ways. John Paul recognized that any kind of political system can reduce its members to the interests of the whole in some way. And so he spoke out against Soviet totalitarianism specifically to say that was an example of reducing the individual to the interests of the state, and that failed to live up to the Christian standard for what it means to be a person and what it means to have a society. At the same time, he looked at the ways that highly capitalist societies can reduce people to the needs of the market. And he pointed out that both of these are inappropriately reductive and destructive of human personhood. So he was able to stand and say that as Pope at that point, he was not compelled to support any human political system. Again, they don't occur in nature. They are things that we build. But that he could recognize a Christian perspective is one that offers a critique of every system that we have built. So that's been an important thing to acknowledge.
AI is becoming more and more prevalent in our society. Do you see it as a positive or a negative, and how it could possibly affect the common good?
David, you want to ask me a question about Star Wars? you were threatening that. So in many ways, it's going to depend on the use case. Computer systems are great at pattern recognition. That's one of the things that potentially gives them, say, important outcomes in medical fields where they might pick up on patterns in scans or tests that humans might miss, simply because we don't at all times have the degree of data that lets us see the pattern. At the same time, for any kind of creative work, if my students are talking about, text generating robots, hate them. That, I think, is a fundamental betrayal of what it means to be human. We are human, we are creative, computer programs are not. They're averaging machines, that's how they work. So depending on the use case, I think it is possible to find limited sort of pockets of usefulness. But there's a poster from IBM in the 70s that said, a computer can never be held accountable, and therefore a computer should never make a management decision. And I'm very much on that kind of line. I'm that kind of Luddite. Decisions that need to be distinctly human need to be distinctly made by humans, as a way of trying to make sure that we recognize the real questions and the real stakes involved and thought about them adequately.
Isaac, thank you very much for sharing this with us and for giving us something to think about. Thank you all for participating. God bless.